Okay, imagine this for a second. Secret national security goals. Goals that, directly hit your country's healthcare. Like how many hospital beds are available.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like something out of a thriller, doesn't it?
It really does. But this is actually happening
Yeah.
right now in the Netherlands. And that's what we're diving into today, these opaque resilience goals the Netherlands agreed to with NATO.
And the big questions swirling around them, right? What do they mean for hospitals, for political transparency even?
Yeah, exactly. So our deep dive today, we're unpacking the controversy around these secret NATO resilience objectives. Mark Rutte, then Prime Minister, agreed to them back in 2023.
And these aren't just like abstract defense ideas. They're actively shaping policy now
Eh.
across 5 different ministries.
Including public health, yeah, but also energy, infrastructure. It's broad.
Uh-huh.
So our mission here is to explore what's actually known, drawing from that YouTube report, 10P1 Met Agema by Erwin Tams. It features Fleur Agema, the former health minister, and former MP Harry Van Bommel.
Right, trying to navigate this complex mix of international deals, what's happening at home, and this critical issue of, well, how much do we actually get to know?
Let's cut through the noise and get to the core insights that affect everyone. So let's start with Fleur Agema. She's a politician who really made her name fiercely advocating for healthcare, especially when she was in opposition.
Oh, yeah. She was famous for criticizing previous governments, saying they just weren't prepared for a health crisis. Remember the pandemic?
Exactly. But then things changed. She becomes Minister of Health, Welfare, and Sport. And suddenly her mandate shifts quite significantly.
That's right. There was this initial pandemic preparedness program set up after COVID, had $300 million earmarked for it.
But that gets put on hold, effectively, because of new government agreements.
And her new focus, this much broader concept, resilience. Weerbaarheid in Dutch.
And this resilience, it's not just about new viruses or pandemics anymore.
No, not at all. It's way broader. It includes preparing for, well, war scenarios, terrorist attacks, even providing care for wounded NATO allies.
Wow, okay. That's a huge expansion for a health ministry.
It is. And Agema herself talks about this dilemma. She feels bound by the agreements of her new job, even admitting it feels painful, given what she used to argue for.
She actually said, didn't she, something like, this assignment is not naturally in line with what I have always said, and that is painful, but I will still have to carry out the assignments.
Yeah, pretty explicit, acknowledging that tension between her past stance and her current duties.
Okay, so this broader resilience agenda, who's actually running the show? Because it spans multiple ministries.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting. The National Coordinator for Security and Counterterrorism, the NCTV, they're the ones coordinating it.
The NCTV, the counterterrorism body.
Across about 5 ministries, not just health. We're talking energy supply, ICT, infrastructure, like roads needed for heavy military vehicles.
That's surprising. Former MP Harry Van Bommel, he expressed surprise too, right? About the NCTV being the sort of spider in the web.
Yeah, he questioned it. Given their background, more in the intelligence world, why are they leading on something like healthcare capacity for resilience?
So what's Agema's explanation for that?
Well, she clarifies that the NCTV's role is specifically to coordinate the broader resilience agenda precisely because it involves so many different ministries. It's not just about pandemic preparedness anymore.
She stresses, the connection here is resilience, and that is broader.
So it suggests this very integrated, systemic approach to national security, but it definitely raises questions, doesn't it, about oversight and, frankly, expertise when an intelligence-focused body directs policy across health, energy, transport.
Absolutely. Okay, so while these big strategic decisions are being made, what's the reality on the ground in the Dutch healthcare system? Specifically intensive care, the IC units.
Yeah, this is where it really hits home for people. You remember during COVID, the constant calls for more IC capacity. Agema herself was often leading that charge.
I do. So has it improved?
Well, that's the worrying part. Despite all those warnings, despite the lessons we supposedly learned, operational IC beds are actually still declining.
Declining. How many are there now?
Currently below 850. Which is way short of the target they agreed on, 1,150 beds in the Integrated Care Agreement.
But wait, don't they have the equipment? I thought I read they could scale up.
They do. They have the equipment, the ventilators, the monitors to potentially go up to 1,700 beds.
So what's the bottleneck?
It's staff. A severe lack of trained nursing staff to actually run those beds. It's not about the physical stuff, it's about the people.
And are the people on the front lines, the doctors and nurses, are they raising the alarm?
Oh, definitely. The Dutch Association for Intensive Care, the NVIC representing almost 1,000 specialists, they sent 2 urgent letters directly to Minister Ajima.
Urgent letters. What do they say?
They highlighted this alarming decline in IC capacity. They stressed the need for a proper plan supported by everyone, with the NVIC themselves taking the lead.
Did they suggest solutions?
They did. Practical things like integrating funding for ICUs, emergency departments, even acute obstetrics. The idea was to allow more flexible training and deployment for staff, hopefully making those careers more attractive.
That sounds logical.
Ah!
So what was the response to these letters?
Nothing.
Nothing. No response at all.
That's what the report indicates. No response to these urgent pleas from the specialists on the ground.
Wow. What does that signal about the priorities, or maybe the perceived urgency?
It suggests a real disconnect, perhaps. Ajima acknowledges the workforce shortage is a huge problem. She frames it from her end, saying something like, I am empowered, I just don't always have enough money.
Right. Which points maybe to a deeper issue, where the political drive and the money aren't matching the needs being screamed about by the professionals.
Exactly. It hints at that tension.
Okay. And speaking of money, this brings us to that really fascinating quote from Minister Ajima.
Oh, the NATO one.
Yeah. She says provocatively, if money were the problem, NATO would be my biggest ally. What on earth does she mean by that?
Well, it's incredibly revealing, isn't it? The interpretation seems to be that funding tied to these NATO resilience tasks flows much more readily from, say, the Ministry of Finance than funds for regular domestic healthcare needs.
So she's implying that if NATO's push for higher defense spending, like going from, 3% to maybe 5% of GDP, if that money could somehow be channeled directly into healthcare capacity, maybe for treating wounded allies as part of resilience.
Then that would actually help her budget problems, not make them worse. It highlights this potential conflict where big national security priorities, maybe with bigger budgets, are overshadowing the day-to-day funding struggle she sees in healthcare.
Which naturally leads to the next big question. Just how transparent are these NATO resilience goals anyway?
Right, because the government says the agreements are politically binding. That sounds serious.
But the actual document, the
No.
one outlining the specifics.
That's not public. NATO itself has classified it.
So, complete secrecy? Is that the idea?
Well, former MP Van Bommel offers a bit of nuance there. He suggests there's a difference between, say, task specialization, like the fact that the Netherlands might provide wounded care. He argues that can be public.
Okay.
But the scale, exactly how many wounded they're planning for, or the precise costs involved, that's what's classified.
And the reason for that is?
Standard security thinking, apparently. That kind of detailed intelligence could be used by an adversary to figure out vulnerabilities, maybe how to paralyze capacity in a crisis.
Makes sense from a security perspective, I guess. But Van Bommel still thinks Parliament needs more info.
Yes, he argues that even if the fine details are kept secret, the fundamental nature of these commitments needs to be clear to Parliament for proper democratic oversight. You need to know what the country is signing up for, broadly speaking.
So there's this tension again. Security versus transparency. And if even Parliament doesn't get the full picture on politically binding deals, how does accountability work? It feels like a gap.
It's a classic dilemma, a very difficult balance to strike.
And digging a bit deeper, there was also some talk, some speculation around Mark Rutte agreeing to these goals. The timing seemed interesting.
Oh, yeah. The fact he agreed to them as caretaker PM in 2023, right before he became NATO Secretary General.
Exactly. Van Bommel suggested Rutte probably knew he was interested in the NATO job months before.
Right. Now, Van Bommel is careful not to call it a perverse conflict of interest, like, a direct financial gain.
But he used another term, concomitant interests.
Or like luck.
Bende belangen.
Precisely. Meaning his actions as prime minister, especially on things like arming Ukraine or these resilience goals, could naturally align with his ambitions for the future NATO role. His decisions benefited NATO, which he was about to lead.
And the potential downside.
That these agreements, while benefiting NATO, could potentially come at the expense of the Dutch interest, straining hospital capacity being a prime example.
So these resilience goals, they're clearly not just about hospitals. It's systemic, touching lots of different areas.
Absolutely. And we saw that play out very directly in Parliament, didn't we? In quite a surprising way.
You mean that motion by the BBB MP Henk Vermeer?
Exactly. He tried to connect the dots. He linked this whole resilience agenda Things like needing better roads for NATO transport duties to really pressing domestic problems,
Like what?
like the nitrogen crisis, housing shortages, support for farmers and businesses. He was basically saying, look, these international commitments have knock-on effects here at home. Let's consider them together.
And how did that go down?
His motion was declared out of order by the speaker, basically shut down.
Out of order. Is that common?
Van Bommel described it as unheard of, highly unusual, his interpretation. It didn't fit the narrative.
What narrative?
The sort of blank check approach to supporting Ukraine and meeting NATO commitments. Vermeer's motion complicated that by bringing in domestic trade-offs.
Van Bommel also mentioned a political tactic, didn't he, when ministers face tough questions?
Yeah, the idea of making it bigger. If you're asked about a specific budget issue or a problem in your ministry, you link it to some huge overarching government policy or an international obligation.
And the specific problem just disappears.
It can seem to, yeah, it gets absorbed into this larger context that's harder to pin down or debate effectively. It kind of deflects the specific criticism.
And it seems like that's maybe what's happened with these resilience goals. The original report wanted to spark a debate.
Exactly, a parliamentary debate about these secret binding agreements. But it seems that debate has been largely missing from the public conversation. The journalist in the report really highlighted the lack of media focus and basically called on the public to start asking questions.
So it really feels like there's this underlying push for, well, clarity, for some democratic oversight on agreements that are politically binding, impacting daily life, but kept largely under wraps.
Yep.
When you look at it, all the icy beds declining, while specialists plead for help, the NCTV taking this huge coordinating role, the secrecy around NATO goals, the deflected parliamentary questions. It's quite a picture, isn't it?
It really is. And if you try to connect the dots, step back and see the bigger picture, it poses a fundamental question for us, for society, really.
Which is?
How do we as citizens in a democracy make sure that these critical national security commitments, which might be necessary, are actually balanced against our domestic needs, like healthcare, housing, and how do we maintain democratic accountability, especially when so many of the key details are kept classified?
That's the multi-billion-euro question, isn't it?
It really is.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. We're in this era where national security isn't just tanks and skies anymore. It's meshed with public health, with our digital infrastructure, even with climate policy.
It touches everything.
So how do we create a public conversation, a discourse, that lets us have informed debates and proper oversight on these complex issues without jeopardizing genuine security needs?
And crucially, how do we ensure that these big decisions, even the ones made behind closed doors for security reasons, ultimately serve the people they're meant to protect? How do we make sure those trade-offs are actually understood and debated by all of us?